we all know that The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is the best game of the year. There's really no contest for it. Nothing else has even come close to touching it. Like, no matter how much people bleed about like Starfield or Baldur's Gate 3, um, in the long term, nobody's going to remember those games compared to Tears of the Kingdom. So much so that apparently there are now articles being written like describing Tears of the Kingdom as being the game of the decade, just like how Breath of the Wild was the game of the decade last year, last decade, right? You know, a true innovator that really raises the bar when it comes to open world game design, to just being creative, being innovative, while being accessible to people of all skill levels, right? Tears of the Kingdom really is on a level far beyond any other game in the industry right now. And like nobody wants to admit it. Even now, people are trying to say that like, oh, nobody's talking about Tears of the Kingdom right now, like completely unaware, like just how just how amazing this game is. Like it's kind of like how One Piece is as big as it is. Like bigger than Batman now, and like you don't see people talking about it like in public or in online really, like outside of their communities, because like we don't need to talk about a product that we're this invested in, right? Like it almost comes off as like the gaming community in this day and age is all they can do is just talk about like, well, this is talked about more, so that's popular. You know, they did this with Undertale, right? Like, oh, Undertale was talked about on V for like a week when it came out, and it was a really popular game, right? Like, they try doing this thing, but they don't talk about the actual long term viability of the game. They don't talk about like, how fun it actually is, how much content it has, like its unique mechanics, because all they care about, like, oh, it was popular at one point, like that's all, that's their justification for it. It's appalling, but like that seems to have been like the trend over the past like 5 years. Ever since Nintendo started eclipsing companies in sales and critic scores, people have like defaulted to trying and like pretending that other games are being talked about more in order to like justify like complaints against Nintendo. Like, oh, they're not actually popular. Switch is on the way out. Zelda isn't as big of a deal as you think it is. Like so much so that I think a lot of people were like gaslit into thinking Tears of the Kingdom wouldn't sell as much as Breath of the Wild. I myself like maintained that like it wouldn't come close to outselling Breath of the Wild, right? Like I thought that like being reusing the map might put a lot of people off, right? But then the game comes out and it sells 20 million units in like a month, right? Far more than Elden Ring, far more than Baldur's Gate 3, far more than Starfield, I believe, right? Right? This is a legit juggernaut of a franchise right now, and nobody wants to admit it. They're doing everything they possibly can to downplay and ignore this game, and I cannot emphasize it enough. Like they did it with Breath of the Wild, they still won't admit what an innovative, engaging, fresh, new experience that was. Completely unlike all the other crap that was like pushed the decade before that. Stuff like Mass Effect, stuff like The Last of Us, plus stuff like Skyrim, Dark Souls. Like Breath of the Wild was better than all of that, right? And Tears of the Kingdom is better than like all the games it's competing with now. Like honestly, in a lot of ways, I would say it's better than Breath of the Wild, right? I do think Tears of the Kingdom can be considered Breath of the Wild, having gone back and played both. But like, I too often we've seen people like try and say that these games aren't leaving an impact, that nobody really likes them, that they're not popular, but in reality, like the opposite is true. Like we're seeing games on Switch like do better than they ever have before. Like in spite of all the complaints about Pokemon, about how it's allegedly like declined in popularity, like we're seeing developers just you know we're seeing Game Freak like break records, right? We're seeing companies like Xenoblade, like Monolith Soft, put out like some of their most popular titles ever. Games like Fire Emblem Three Houses come out of nowhere and just dominate. Metroid Dread is now the highest selling Metroid game ever made, much to like the detriment of people like Sean Malmstrom, who swore up and down the game would bomb, that it wasn't all that appealing to the hardcore fans of the franchise, that kids wouldn't like it, and now he's trying to like gaslight people into thinking Metroid Prime Remastered sold more, right? Oh, if you combine the sales on the GameCube, on Metroid Prime Trilogy, and the remastered version, you'll find that Metroid Prime technically sold more than Dread. that's not what people were comparing them to. Like people were comparing the original release versus the original release, and Dread is the most popular Metroid game on the market, even though people don't want to admit it. Like going into Dread's release, all people could talk about was like, oh, Hollow Knight is better. Like Dread's gonna bomb. It's not that good. Samus Returns was a disappointment. Like they spent decades, honestly, complaining about not getting enough Metroid games, and then when we finally got them, with Dread, with Samus Returns, with Metroid Prime Federation Force, like the entire industry tried desperately to downplay the situation. They tried very hard to pretend these games weren't popular, that they weren't doing well, that like the developers screwed something up, and that this wasn't what the fans actually wanted. But more and more, the narrative is going against reality. Right? The reality is that Tears of the Kingdom is a huge success. It's very popular among fans and critics. It's sold a ton of units. There is really a ton of great content. Side quests are better than they ever been than they were in the previous game. Like combat is better. The vehicle building is cool and original. There's nothing else like it in all the video games. Like there's all these things about Tears of the Kingdom that come together to make it a masterpiece. It's crazy how often you can just go off the beaten path. You go to like the island in like the south and then get into this altercation with like, oh, there's a bunch of pirates here. Like they've set up a bunch of bases. Oh, you have to go around the island to find this cave where like they have a ship park and you have to go into there and fight all of these guys, but they have like some fortifications going and like you have to get onto the ship. Like, you get into all of these crazy situations, these incredible creative, incredibly well made, engaging, creative encounters with enemies that just never stop. Right? There are endless amounts of ways to tackle situations, to go after them, to do things non-linearly. Like I honestly feel like going back to Breath of the Wild, it's crazy how much differently I'm doing things this time than I was the first time around. Right? Like it's crazy how much innovation you can have, how much creativity is put into the hands of the player, right? It's crazy how these things that I've done in the past over and over again, like constantly feel fresh and new with these games, not just with Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild, but with Pikmin, with Metroid Prime, but with like Super Mario, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, right? Like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Like all these Nintendo games have retained their popularity and success years after release. Like I believe Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze has sold something like 4 million units on Switch after initially having like a disappointing run on Wii U. Like you can argue that that game is now that's fairly disappointing considering the pedigree, but like when you actually stop to think about it, like that game is continuing to sell a decade after release. True, it's not on the same level as Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, but we're at that point now where like Nintendo games withhold their value for so long, people will gladly pay full price for them like 3, 4, 5, 10 years after their initial run. Right? Like Tropical Freeze is still selling to this day. And I imagine after the Mario movie, like this thing has jumped in popularity. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has jumped in popularity. Nintendo products in general have jumped in popularity. And we're still in this phase where people don't want to admit it's happening. They don't want to admit that Nintendo has won the console war and that games like Tears of the Kingdom are going to be looked back on as the best games released in this era, right? Like stuff like Baldur's Gate 3 isn't even going to be a blip on the radar. Much like Baldur's Gate 2, 1 and 2 aren't even remembered in this day and age. Like nobody cares about Baldur's Gate even now. Nobody cares about Starfield even now. Nobody cares about Final Fantasy 16, Diablo 4, Street Fighter 6, Forspoken, Hi-Fi Rush. All of that will be forgotten compared to the much more popular, successful, and engaging, iconic Legend of Zelda games, right? It is crazy what Nintendo has been able to accomplish over the past couple of years, and it is infinitely frustrating to me to see so many people consistently try and downplay it, try and make excuses for how they feel about this, for like why they don't consider Zelda to not even be the best game of the year, right? Like, trying desperately to pretend that Nintendo is not on the top of their game right now, that like other companies are failing, that like things are getting worse and worse every year. Like even now in the current year of 2023, nobody wants to admit it that Nintendo has won. Even now, people will refuse to admit the Switch is a success and is dominating the competition, right? Like, how often do you see YouTubers admit that Nintendo is the market leader? Like, maybe they'll like admit as much like in Japan or whatever, but like they'll still try to convince you that like the Steam Deck is doing great when that isn't true at all. It is crazy. It is crazy to see what's happened over this console generation and seeing people like try and make excuses to still be upset at Nintendo, right? Like in the current year. And this is a really good example of that. Like the hatred and contempt for Tears of the Kingdom, in spite of its overwhelming success, needs to be called out and addressed more often by the community because this stuff is getting way out of hand.